So now we have a pleasure to listen to Geerdt Magiels. He's a biologist and philosopher with a special focus on ecology and philosophy of science. He has been an active board member since the very beginning of the Belgian skeptical organization. He self-defines him as a writer and speaker who seek the right words and images to make science and art, brains and ecosystem, nature and culture more comprehensible. His talk is entitled Biology and Ideology, where science meets opinion. The floor is yours.
What I'm going to do is take you through a little trip through history to all these places where biology and ideology have been meeting. First, maybe something about what I mean with biology and ideology. Biology sounds very easy. That's the science of life, or our life. And what is a science? That's we would think that if we see science then we recognize it, but of course philosophy of science is the whole discussion about what science is and where the demarcation is between science and non-science. But for the time being, I use this morning science as a systematic way of finding and building trustworthy knowledge. So that's my working definition for biology. And then ideology. When I started looking into it, I came to this guy, Antoine Louis-Claude Destutt de Tracy. And he wrote this book, Elements of Ideology, at the end of the 18th century. So that was in the Enlightenment. And for him, ideology was the study of ideas. So that's a very neutral way of trying to understand where ideas come from and how they evolve. In the meantime, political sciences and anthropology have been looking into ideology as something different. I think they define it now as a set of beliefs which is living in a kind of population. And this has some characteristics. In the first place, it's not always transparent that people have an ideology. If you're in a group and everybody thinks the same thing or has the same ideas, then it becomes almost invisible. It has a social function. It brings people together. It contains a lot of convictions, and it has the power of giving people a personal identity. So that's why people identify with some ideologies. And ideologies are usually also not only having descriptive content, like describing how the world is, but also prescriptive things, so how things should be. So that's, I think, how ideology could now be defined. And of course, ideology has also become a little pejorative thing. If you're blinded by your ideology, then that's a bad thing. So far, so good. I go back to the same 18th century to show you the first place where you see how ideas and biology bump into each other. And I start with Carl Linnaeus, and he was, of course, the Swedish founder of the whole nomenclature as we know it now in biology. This is the idea. You give everything a name, you put everything in boxes, you label it, and so you can understand nature. He was doing this for very good reasons. He wanted to understand how the living world could be fit together. To be exact, he was not only doing that with the living world, but also with stones and minerals, which was a little less successful. But he has been successful in the fact that we still use his system to name organisms. This led also him to put the human race into 5 different races. So he was the founder of the idea of racism, that within humankind there are 5 different races, and of course there was a hierarchy. He wasn't playing that out that hard, but he was sowing the scientific seeds for what become later racism. We all know Carl Linnaeus, but this person is far less known. Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon. For French-speaking people, this is just one of the great literators of the French language. His collected works are in the Pléiade library, so that means that you've reached the highest you can in French language. But he was more. He was a pre-Darwinian thinker. He was seeing the world as a very complex thing, and he was opposite of Linnaeus. While Linnaeus was a splitter, splitting everything up in blocks and separate entities, he was a lumper. He was putting everything together. He said you can't describe just a species apart from all the others. There's continuity. And he was thinking about how species could evolve one into another. He was also thinking that the world was much older than people had been thinking until that time. He looked at geology, he looked at fossils, and he was really a pre-Darwinian thinker, and maybe even an ecologist. He saw the connections between different organisms and that they couldn't do without each other. So here you see at the start of modern biology, a competition between two ideas, the splitters and the lumpers. This is out of one of his books, Histoire naturelle, many volumes. And so it described the animals as they were, and he tried to do that as complete as possible, which meant that even with his 15 volumes or so of books describing rhinoceroses and some kinds of birds in all their complexity, he didn't find enough words to write the whole complexity of one organism into one description. That was where he bumped into the limits of language and his science at that time. I stay in the 18th century because there was another conflict between science and ideology. Here you see Benjamin Franklin, who was thinking about making lightning rods. You see here that is presumably one of the lightning rods he used. The conflict with existing ideology was that there were no lightning rods at that time, and church spires were a favorite point of entry for lightning. And people were thinking that if there was a thunderstorm with lightning, you had to go out and ring the bells, and that would keep the thunder and the lightning away. But of course, if you're ringing a bell, which is in metal, with a wet rope, and lightning is coming, hundreds of people have died in these churches while the churches burned down because there were no lightning rods. And then this Benjamin Franklin came and he said, well, we can deviate this energy into the earth without any damage happening. And he was opposed by people believing that the lightning was a message from God. Probably we did something wrong. So who are we to deviate this message from God into the earth? It took quite some time before the first lightning rods were indeed installed, not only on churches, but also on munition depots, which were also very often going up into the air. Another, in the same 18th century, it was the beginning of vaccination. It started as variolation against smallpox, but it became with Jenner, more known than his predecessors, vaccination. And we now know anti-vax movements, but that's not a new thing. It is sold as the vaccines themselves. Because people were thinking the same way as about the lightning rods. If God decides that we are going to be ill, maybe die, then so be it. Who are we to prevent us becoming ill? So the inventors of vaccines have been fighting against these people who, for various reasons, were against vaccination, to defend what they were doing. Now I proceed a little bit into last century, the 19th century. Here you see somebody, probably many people of you have heard about, Trofim Lyssenko. He was a biologist, but a very bad one, I think. And he was a friend of Stalin, or was favored by Stalin. And he had this idea that Mendelian genetics was not idealistic, was not conform the dialectical idea behind revolutions. It was too bourgeois. And he said, thinking within a Marxist, Stalinist framework, that we had to kind of badly understood Lamarckian idea that if we change the environment, we can change our destiny, or the destiny of plants in this case. Because he said if we put seeds into moisture and into the cold, they become resistant against cold, and then we can sow them out and we have big harvests. Of course, it didn't work. Plants nor animals acquire characteristics during their life and hand it on to the next generation. That's not how it works. So the result was huge hungers and maybe millions of people dying by hunger. At the same time, there was another biologist who's probably far less known, Ed.O Wilson. And he was a real good biologist. He went out to collect seeds from all over the world, trying to find the most primitive seeds and fruits of many plants, because he thought they have some genetic wisdom inside, which we could use to improve the crops we have now. But that was not to the liking of Stalin, so Lyssenko ended up in working camps, and that's where he died. He was the first to start a seed collection, which was held in Leningrad. And during the siege of Stalingrad at that time, it was kept by his few of his aides to prevent the collection of being destroyed during the whole war. And they succeeded, actually. He died, but we still have his biological heritage. These are the Vavivlov centers, as plant ecologists call it. These are the places where many of the most primitive variations of many of the grains and the fruits we know are coming from. So we are still using this idea in modern biology. Next comes somebody everybody knows, of course, Charles Darwin. He came up with the evolution theory, and we all know that we still work with it, and although there's some discussion about it in some circles, still, his biological theory was the basis for many people outside of biology to start thinking about using his ideas, or how they understood them, into society. So there was, for instance, Carnegie, one of the big entrepreneurs in the United States, who thought, well, this is the proof that we just have to compete with each other, and the one who competes best will survive and become the biggest. So that was for him a justification for a kind of free, capitalistic, competitive society. At the other side, there were people like Peter Protomkin, who was a Marxist biologist in Russia, who picked up other ideas from Darwin. He said altruism, working together, cooperation, is essential for evolving towards a better world. So he used another part of ideas within Darwin's theory to pronounce non-capitalist or anti-capitalist Marxist ideas. So you see that biological ideas, or ideas from biological science, can be used in very different ways, in ideological ways. And this, of course, is one of the famous ones in that respect. Francis Galton, he was a half-cousin of Charles Darwin, and he was a good mathematician and statistician, but he developed the idea that some races, and that's something that came from, of course, from Linnaeus, were better than the others, and that we should help evolution a little bit with the racial hygiene. And he developed what he thought was a new science, eugenics. He was the first to coin the concept and the word of eugenics, and he, well, it led to terrible things, of course. The thing is, he was very well received in the United States, and something which we probably don't know that well is that eugenics was not just something that popped up in World War II in Germany, but it was already for half a century very lively and very strong all over the world, especially in the States and in Nordic countries. And I quote Galton with something that borders on the justification of genocide, when he stated, "There exists a sentiment, for the most part quite unreasonable, against the gradual extinction of an inferior race." So he writes down that some people are against the idea, but that's certain irrational thinking because we could improve races. So he laid down there the basis for something horrible, which came later. But before that time, there was Madison Grant, who wrote in 1916 a book, Passing of the Great Race. And that was about Nordic superiority. The Nordic race was supposed to be superior to all the others. And some people in European politics are still using that idea that the Nordic race is still superior to all the others. So this is the biological source where all these things come from. And of course that escalated into, well, the very tragic low point in ideology and biology mixing up in Hitler's Nazi destruction of all the people that were not worth living, right? The racist hygiene idea came to the forefront in the Second World War, or already was happening before that time, and they probably 300,000 people with a handicap or with mental problems, or that are not conform the norms of the Nazis, they were extinguished, and that's an awful lot of people. It was called Aktion T4 because of the Tiergartenstraße number 4, where the whole project started. This is the letter of Hitler igniting the whole thing, and you see the Hartmann Euthanasia Center, where in the basement, I think something like 18,000 people have been killed. All powered by the idea that they had to improve the human race and that all people that were not fit for survival, a wrong interpretation, of course, of what Darwin had been saying, that they should be taken out of the human gene stock. I continue to farther up in the 20th century. This is Ed.O Wilson. He was a biologist, very well known as a specialist of ants. And he wrote in the 70s a book called Sociobiology. And he described how genes and the biology is part of the explanation we can deliver for human behavior, or animal behavior in general and human behavior also. And at that time, that was really a shock to many people. They saw eugenics coming back, and they thought that he was reducing all our human behavior to genes and to heredity, which was, of course, not what he meant to say. But he was the first since the Second World War who dared to think about something like that. There was the idea before that we were born as a blank slate, and that our culture and education and the environment was going to make us into the people we are. And Wilson very clearly demonstrated in his book and in research that there's some very deep ground biological causes for many things we do and think and feel. It's the whole nature-nurture debate, which has been taken on now for 50 years or so. We now know that you can't even try to pull them apart. But he was, as the first one, trying to point to the importance of the nature in the whole formula of nature versus nurture. I continue a little bit, and here we come at the photo in the top left is at the American Psychiatric Association meeting in San Francisco in 1972 or 3, I'm not sure, where one of the psychiatrics masked himself because he didn't want to be known. He was a homosexual, and he gave a talk against the fact that homosexuality was still in the DSM, the standard psychiatric manual for diagnosis. Until that time, homosexuality was considered as a disease, as a pathology, which could be cured, or should be cured, even. Together with some other homosexual psychiatrists, he started a campaign to get homosexuality out of the DSM. It took them almost a decade to succeed, but now homosexuality is not seen as a disease anymore, but one of these many variations in sexual behavior. And we have now the same thing with transgenders and the whole discussion about how many forms of sexual or gender behavior are there possible. And you see just one example of a campaign trying to convince people that if you feel in a different way in your body and your relationship with other people than the classic heterosexual way of feeling yourself, then that's not a disease, but that's a variation on the very many possibilities there are in sexual behavior. So this discussion on how our biological nature influences or defines our sexual behavior and the way we feel is pretty old and is always coming back. And a couple of years ago, there was this, which was quite a shock for many people, I think, because the National Geographic, which is one of the biggest magazines in the world, they've got millions of subscribers. It's from America, this so-called very conservative country. And they came with this complete issue about the gender revolution. So from a point where you wouldn't expect it, they described how different and how much variation there can be in how people feel and how gender can be influenced by very many things. Pleading for more respect for all these people who, up till then, hadn't been considered to be normal. I mean, maybe some people tolerated them, but not that many people thought it was just another way of being a human. And very recently, there have been two books coming out. Frans de Waal, he has been mentioned, I think, before this weekend, deceased very recently. The last book he wrote he's a primatologist. He knows everything about primates, apes, and many other animals, amongst them humans. And he describes how gender, which is for some people still a difficult concept, exists in the animal world. He describes how some of the apes he knew very well were behaving asexually. They were not interested in sexual intercourse. It was a female behaving very much like a male, playing with the males, not bothering about the females. And he describes, the whole book is full with that kind of descriptions of animals doing things we thought would be probably only very human, but they exist all over in the kingdom. And the book on the right-hand side, Lucy Cook, a biologist also, describes behavior of the female part of the species, which is so variated, and the sex roles are so different, can be so different, and changing even in the lifetime of one organism. She describes fish that are hermaphrodite and they behave like males in the morning and females in the afternoon, vice versa. So the orthodox idea we have about males are an organism that produces sperm and females are organisms that produce eggs, and that's it. There's a lot more about it. I'm not going to go into detail into this whole discussion, but if you want to read any books about it, these are the two you have to go to, I think. So you see here also that these biologists are up against an ideology, which is not in the pejorative way it is, but primatology has for years and years been the business of male, white specialists in their field, And it was on the moment when women started looking into the whole thing. And they started seeing that for them, had nothing seen before, and they said, let's pay attention to these things in the behavior of animals and ourselves that have been overlooked until now. Because everybody was thinking from the old perspective that males are promiscuous, they wanted to disperse their sperm as much as possible, and that's why they are aggressive. And the females, they are just receptive, and they have to take care of their fertilized eggs. There's much more going on in nature than that. And Lucy Cook is one of these females who pays attention to all these things that have been overlooked all those years. Another thing which has been overlooked is, and that's another discussion ideologically behind a lot of biological research, is how is consciousness something of humans? Are we the only species that are above, on top of the evolutionary line? And consciousness is something we only have, in intelligence, etc. These two books talk about the fact that the differences between humans and all the rest of the zoology is far less big than we might think. The book on the left is about dreaming in animals. Anybody who has a dog at home knows that they sometimes lay sleeping and they start moving their legs and moving their eyes like REM. Well, we dog owners know that dogs dream, right? We don't know that they dream, but if you look at our partner in bed who's doing the same thing, we think they dream, right? But if animals dream, even these octopuses that change from color during their sleep, at the same way they change color while hunting or eating, then you think, well, what are they doing? Yeah, we don't know, of course. We can't put them in a scanner. We can't put them in an EEG machine. But yeah, probably there's more happening there than we have ever dared to think about. We have now more instruments to study it. But still, even if we wake up somebody in REM sleep and then we ask, have you been dreaming? Sometimes they have not, sometimes they don't remember, and sometimes they have some kind of strange story. Right? We can't do that with an octopus or with an elephant. But still, he poses some questions about if that's true, if they even have only a limited amount of dreaming as we know it, then it says something about their way of being in this world, and maybe they are more conscious than we think. And that's the same message of the other book, Beyond Words, What Animals Think and Feel. They are so much more intelligent than we have been thinking, because we just opened up ourselves not enough to allow the possibility that that they have more capabilities and more things they can do and think and feel than we have ever thought. Some other ideological ways in which science and medicine has been influenced. The first one is an article on women's pain. And because doctors have, for ages, been male, they thought that women didn't feel pain like other people. They were much less sensitive. It sounds crazy now, but that has been the way of thinking. Premenstrual syndromes, menopause, all these typical female things have always been discarded as being not that painful. Even the symptoms of a heart attack are different on average, different in females and in males. And that's the reason why many women have a heart attack without anybody noticing it or without anybody taking care of it. Yeah? So you see here that our view on female physiology, the fact that we have been thinking that the egg is just a passive receptor of the sperm, right? 150 years ago, people wrote down that the egg itself was worth nothing. It had to be vitalized by the sperm, right? As if the uterus and everything around it is not a very important ecosystem, to say it that way, in which the sperm may be happy to survive, right? So we have been thinking from this very male-centered ideological idea on pain in women and symptoms in general. The same with taking pain black seriously, which is an article from the New England Journal of Medicine. We have been thinking for decades that the skin of black people was thicker than the one of white people. And that was one of the reasons why they didn't get as much anesthesia as the white people. Just the silly idea that their skin was supposed to be bigger or thicker than ours, and so they were more resistant to whatever disease. Strange but true, these things are changing now, but you see that it takes a fight against a hidden set of ideas that influences the way we think about the world. Another thing about pain, you see here the Holy Mary who's been pierced by, typically a woman then, who's been pierced by a lot of daggers, probably because she didn't feel it or something. But there was this idea, and I've been working on analgesics for some time in the past, and in the 80s, there was still a big difference in the use of analgesics between the north and the south of Europe. The more Catholic people were, the less they were inclined to use analgesics, because they thought pain, as you see in the upper left corner, is part of our existence, right? You have to go through some pain. Life is suffering, and if you want to come in heaven, then you have to suffer from now and then. So taking analgesics is like a physiological lightning rod. You have to let the pain go, and you have to go through it. There has been a big fight to use epidural anesthesia during birth for women, because all these male gynecologists, they thought, well, yeah, it can't be that hurtful giving birth. Of course, they never experienced it itself, and they never asked the women what they thought about it. But it was a big struggle to convince them that there was really a lot of pain involved there, and that you could solve it in some way if necessary. You don't have to give every woman in giving birth epidural anesthesia, of course. Another place where ideology bumped into biology was the marshmallow test. Everybody knows the marshmallow test, probably. It was testing the way kids could resist taking a sweet if they could stay away from it, that they could get more sweets in some time. They did this also with black children, and they said, yeah, the black children are not so resistant against persuasion. Yeah, they performed very badly in this test. Afterwards, it turned out that these black people were coming from poor families, and of course, these poor kids, they were living under a lot of stress, and if you're under a lot of stress, you're trained to survive in the short term. So if there's now food, you're gonna now take it, because in a few moments' time it can be gone, and then you're there without food. So that was the underlying thing, which was not seen by the white researchers. Ideology can also be used against science. There has been a long struggle before anybody was convinced that asbestos was bad, because there was a big lobby of the asbestos industry. Same with smoking. Yeah? It's taken decades before everybody started realizing that smoking was indeed so bad, because the tobacco industry kept on sowing seeds of doubt. Yeah, it's not really proven. Same thing with GMOs and with anti-climate lobby, paid by people who are involved in the whole thing. So I'm rounding off now. There's a lot of more examples and a lot of more stories, but let's look at what producing knowledge through science involves. We have been thinking, well, some people have been thinking that science should be without values, which is nonsensical. In science, we have values, and here you see a couple of them. We call them epistemic values. If you want to collect trustworthy knowledge, you need some things. Your knowledge or your thesis should be coherent. They should be accurate, trustworthy, transparent, empirical, conceptually precise. You have to allow criticism and self-criticism. It should be falsifiable. These are just a few. You can give a whole course on this, because it's the kernel of philosophy of science. What makes science to some other kind of knowledge than all the others? And the thing is, of course, scientists are humans. So is activist science good or bad? This is a quote from a young scientist who says that science is part of the real world, with real people, with real problems, and sharing knowledge with society for the benefit of society is part of your job. You shouldn't be afraid of that as a scientist. I'm a biologist. I started studying biology in the 70s to save the world, because we saw how the environment was going in the wrong direction. And of course, if you are committed to something and you think something is very important, it's okay that you come out and even becoming an activist, but you should still know all the time that the facts you use to enforce your message are right, and you should say it also. Being transparent is very important. And the discussion at this moment in the academic world about freedom of speech at universities, which is something different than academic freedom, I would say. This is R.K. Merton. He's a sociologist of science and knowledge. And he says universities should be places of organized skepticism. Science is a kind of a jungle in which very many ideas live and conflict. And universities should be one of these places where you can discuss these things openly and with respect to each other and build on facts. And you can discuss how these facts have come into being, but that's part of the scientific or academic thing you want to do. And I end with this. This is just a Zen koan-like takeaway. Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. Even if you have ideologies, you can take it away, but at some point there's something that is still there, right? And that's what it's all about. What's still there if all the rest is taken off? That's right.
Merci d'avoir regardé cette vidéo. N'hésitez pas à la partager autour de vous et à vous abonner sur notre chaîne YouTube pour recevoir les prochaines. Nous vous rappelons également que vous pouvez retrouver le dernier numéro de la revue de l'AFIS Sciences et Pseudosciences en kiosque et sur notre boutique en ligne, ainsi qu'accéder gratuitement à tous les anciens numéros sur notre site internet afis.org et sur notre application smartphone Afis Sciences. De plus, si vous souhaitez soutenir notre association, vous pouvez également adhérer via notamment notre site internet. Encore merci, à bientôt!